Good morning and welcome to the Birketts Charities Team webinar on setting up a charity or a social enterprise. Thank you very much for joining me this morning. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Liz Brownsell. I'm a partner and head of charities at Birketts. Now, before I get started on the webinar, just a few preliminary points. Firstly, as I'm sure you'll all appreciate, the third sector is a really broad and diverse sector filled with a huge variety of fantastic organisations. And so it's not going to be possible for me to cover absolutely everything that might be relevant to what you're thinking of doing in setting up a new charity or social enterprise. What I will do is focus on the key considerations that we think are most likely to be relevant to all of you and the sorts of issues that we tend to have to advise on when we're discussing setting up charities and social enterprises with our clients. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the webinar. I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then I'll answer as many of your questions as I can. Thank you to those of you who have sent questions in advance, but for those of you who haven't, if anything crops up as I'm going through and you've got a question, please do pop it in the question box and I'll get to them as many of them as I can at the end of the session. Finally, just to say, of course, I can't give any specific advice on any particular proposals, so please do keep your questions general and on topic. Okay, so what we're going to be covering today, I'm going to start by talking to you about what you need to think about to choose between setting up a charity and a social enterprise. Then I'm going to take you through some of the key legal structures available for both charities and social enterprises, and I'm going to round off with just a few top tips to help you get started. Now, just to begin with, I'm really interested to know what you are here for today. So I'm going to kick things off with a very quick poll, and it's a really easy one, so don't worry. I just would like to know whether you're here because you're thinking of setting up a charity, whether you're here because you're thinking of setting up a social enterprise, or whether you're just not sure, or you're here for information at the moment. So if you could answer the poll, which should appear on your screen momentarily, I'll give you a few moments to answer that, and then we'll just have a look and see what percentage we've got in the room in each category. Okay, fantastic. I think that's almost everybody voting there. So we've got quite a lot of you who are in the I'm not sure, I'm just here for general information category at the moment, which is absolutely fine. Hopefully by the end of the session, you'll have more information and be a bit clearer about what you'd like to do. And for those of you who are thinking of setting up a charity or a social enterprise, hopefully the information today will help you to get started. What I will do at the end of the session is repeat the poll just to see how things have shifted. Okay, great. So choosing between a charity and a social enterprise, there are a large number of considerations to take into account. I've grouped these into three categories. So the first is purpose, the second is funding and tax, and the final consideration is control and regulation. Now, these aren't necessarily all of the things that you might need to consider, but these are the sorts of things that we look at when advising on the best structure for your purposes. So beginning with purpose. Now, this is the most important thing to consider. And the reason for that is that to be a charity or a social enterprise, what distinguishes you from a trading company or a business is purpose. You are not established simply to make money for the profit of shareholders. You are established for some other community, philanthropic, benevolent purpose. And so understanding what it is that you're setting out to achieve is absolutely critical. It is also incredibly important in determining whether you should be a charity or a social enterprise. And this is because of the legal definition of charity. It's set out in Section 1 of the Charities Act. And as you'll see from the slide on screen, the definition is that it is an institution established for charitable purposes only. That's really important. To be a charity in England and Wales, you absolutely must have exclusively charitable purposes. And the law has developed over a very long period of time in determining what is and is not considered a charitable purpose. Section 2 of the Charities Act defines charitable purpose as one of the purposes listed in Section 3 of the Act and a purpose that is for the public benefit. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the purposes listed in section 3, but there is a finite list. There are 13 what we call heads of charitable purpose, which are depicted and illustrated on the screen at the moment. There is a huge amount of guidance on charitable purposes on the Charity Commission website. And whatever you're looking to do, you should have a look on the Charity Commission website for the specific guidance relevant to the category that you think your activities fall within. For some purposes, there's more detailed guidance than others, and it really depends on how long-standing and how evolved that charitable purpose is. But it's very, very specific. And just because you might be doing something that you think falls within a charitable purpose doesn't necessarily mean that the law will recognise it as such. So it is important to read and understand the criteria that apply for each category. Now, I can't go through all 13 categories. So just to give you a couple of examples, and this one's a nice illustrative example. In the category, one of the most oldest heads of charitable purpose, advancement of religion, there was quite recently a very interesting application submitted to the Commission to register the Temple of the Jedi Order as a charity. And the Commission's determination was that Jediism is not a religion for legal purposes in charity law, and so the application was rejected. Now, what's good about that decision is in reaching that decision, the Commission went through quite an interesting overview of what the law says is a religion for charitable purposes, and it is not the same as what the Equality Act says is a religion. So the legal definition of religion for charity purposes has been determined in case law and is very precise. Now, those of you out there who are Star Wars fans, including, for example, my other half, might be holding your head in your hands and thinking, how on earth could Jediism not be recognized as a religion? But the law is very precise about how charitable purposes are determined. So that's just an example. There are some categories of charitable purpose that you might find when you're looking, actually, what I want to do doesn't sit really neatly in any of these headings, and that's because there is a 13th head called any other charitable purpose, which is effectively a legislative loophole that allows the courts and case law and the Commission to respond to evolving social needs. And there are examples of more recently recognised charitable purposes, such as social inclusion and urban and rural regeneration. And you will find guidance about them on the website, but you won't necessarily find them with their own heading, but it doesn't mean that they aren't a charitable purpose. Now, this is clearly a very complicated, very technical area. So if you're in any doubt about whether or not what you're looking to do is a charitable purpose, of course, you can seek professional advice to support you. Now, even if you have determined, looking at all of the guidance, that what you are planning to do is a charitable purpose, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's right for you to set up a charity. So the next thing to think about is funding and tax. And the first question to ask yourself is, how will you fund your organisation? And as you can see from the slide, there are a huge number of options for funding your organisation. The ones that you see on the left there, these are the ones that are most likely to tip the balance in favour of a charity. And there are 3 reasons for this. If you are looking primarily to fund your organisation through a large endowment, either from yourself as a founder or from a benefactor, one or more benefactors, you might find that for higher rate taxpayers, there is a real driver in gift aid because of the tax advantages in personal tax planning of donating to charities. Similarly, if you're looking for public donations or donations from corporations, there are gift aid advantages. And so what you might find is that if you're really going to be reliant on that as a source of funding, being a charity will give you more of an appeal to the public or to benefactors or companies for making donations to your organisation. The other key factors that are relevant for people looking to make donations are regulation, and that gives assurance and trust, that element of public trust and confidence that there is in charities because of how regulated they are, and transparency. All charities that are registered are required to submit their accounts to the Charity Commission, and there's a huge amount of publicly available information on the Charity Commission website. At the other end of the spectrum are investors. Now, if you're looking to fund your organisation primarily through investment, where you are thinking of giving a return, whether that's modest or significant to those investors, well, that would exclude charitable status. it is not possible for anybody to take any personal profit out of the success of a charity. So you cannot have people investing for a return in a charity. So if that's something you're looking at, then you absolutely are in the category of social enterprise. Now, in the middle, there are a range of other types of funding which are not necessarily determinative. It really depends on what you're looking to do, and there are some considerations to take into account. If you're looking for sponsors for your organisation, there are some VAT considerations there. And again, this is a specialist area, and you might need to look for specialist VAT advice from a tax advisor. But for charities, there are some circumstances where sponsors can have exemptions from VAT. For example, event fundraising. The exemptions need to be very, very carefully looked at in order to ensure that you comply, of course, but those are considerations to take into account. If you're looking to fund your organisation through loans, charities can borrow. There is nothing necessarily to stop you borrowing as a charity, but you might want to consider that as a startup organisation, banks maybe would want to take personal guarantees in respect of loans. And it wouldn't be appropriate to ask volunteers, so trustees, to provide personal guarantees in respect of an organisation from which they receive no personal benefit. So where you're looking at loan funding, that might tip the balance towards a social enterprise structure. Grants is another key consideration. If you are looking at applying for grant funding to finance what you're planning to do, it's really crucially important to have a look at the specific criteria that the grant funding bodies you're looking at will apply. Some grant funders will only fund registered charities or have a preference for funding registered charities. Others are more than happy to fund social enterprises, but might have specific criteria about governance requirements and demonstration of lack of profit for personal gain. So whatever the criteria are, you should have a look at the specific grant funding bodies that you are thinking of applying to, and either make sure that what you are doing in terms of structure will satisfy their requirements, or if that structure doesn't fit what you're looking to do or your purpose, you might need to consider alternative forms of funding before you get started. And finally, trading. Again, this doesn't necessarily mean that you can't be a charity. Charities can trade, and there are specific types of trading that can be done without limit within a charity. So trading in advancement of a charitable purpose can be done within a charity, and you don't need to worry about the amount of trading that you're doing. But there are very specific rules for charities about trading, and where you are entering into a trading activity purely to make profit for the charity to use in advancement of its purposes, there are restrictions for charities in relation to that. And then you might be looking at a more complicated structure where you need a trading subsidiary to carry out that activity. Now, I can't get into the complexities of group structure arrangements on this webinar because it's an entirely separate topic, but it does make your proposal more complicated if you're looking at doing anything like that, and you're more likely to need professional advice. So it's just something to bear in mind. Now, I've mentioned a couple of things here about tax already, but there are some other key considerations when it comes to tax. I'm not a tax advisor. I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but you should think about the implications of tax and tax reliefs that are available to charities on what you're planning to do and how you're going to finance and have enough finance to achieve your purposes. Charities benefit in a quid pro quo for the heavy regulation that applies to them. They benefit from a huge number of tax reliefs, which are not available to social enterprises. So if any of these tax situations apply, so if you're likely to need, for example, to retain profits at the end of your tax year to either build up a set of reserves for a particular proposal or for working capital, and you would then, as a social enterprise, be paying corporation tax on those profits, then you might want to consider the advantages of charitable status in that respect, because charities don't pay corporation tax. It's just one example. Now, there are all sorts of other considerations. If you're buying a property, again, charities benefit from business rates relief, which social enterprises generally do not. But this is a very specialist area, and I would encourage you to seek professional advice from tax advisors if you're at all unsure and you don't have the expertise yourself to consider the impact of tax on what you're planning to do. Okay, so once you've considered funding and tax, you might have got to a point where you think you know which way you want to go. But if not, and it's still kind of in the balance, then control and regulation is the next consideration to take into account. Starting with control, the question to ask yourself is, how much control do you want? Who's going to be in control of the organisation and how will they control it? Now, for charities, a really critical thing to understand is that there is no sense, there's no concept of ownership of a charity. Yes, there are people who control it. The trustees of a charity make the decisions. They're responsible for the management and administration of the charity, but they do not own the charity. Nobody can have an ownership of it. There are a lot of people that can have an interest in the charity's activities, and we tend to refer to them as stakeholders. But your question here is, how many stakeholders will be involved and how? What level of control do they want and why? And what's going to be most appropriate for this particular organisation? If you want to have complete control, you want to remain entirely in control, and you want to be a sole director, for example, and a sole member, then you're probably not looking at a charity, because if you want that level of control, that's just not going to fit with the sort of governance structure that's appropriate for a charity. Another consideration here is whether you or anybody else who will be in control of the organisation will receive any kind of remuneration or reward for your work. Again, for charities, this is just not appropriate. Trustees are volunteers, and you cannot remunerate a trustee for their role as such without the consent of the Charity Commission. So if one of the things that's important to you as a founder is that you will receive a wage or remuneration for what you're doing, then again, this might tip the balance away from charity towards social enterprise. Another consideration alongside control is regulation. Now, as I've already alluded to, the gold standard of regulation is charities. They are very heavily regulated by a proactive regulator in the Charity Commission. There is a huge amount of public trust and confidence in charities, and it's the Commission's job to safeguard that. And so they are very proactive in their regulation. There are also lots of opportunities for people who are interested in the activities of the charity to submit complaints, to whistleblow, and the Commission has a huge range of statutory powers to investigate and step in if anything is untoward. At the other end of the scale, a normal company that's regulated purely by company law and Companies House doesn't have anywhere near that level of regulation. Yes, there's company law that needs to be complied with, but Companies House is not a regulator in the sense that the Charity Commission is. Somewhere in the middle, you've got community interest companies, and there is something called a KIC regulator, which is responsible for regulation of community interest companies. And I'll come on to that legal structure in a moment. But the KIC regulator is what we call a light touch regulator. It does not proactively and heavily regulate KICs in the way that the Charity Commission does for charities. Of course, across all of this, you've got HMRC, but again, HMRC is relevant to all types of organisations, and the regulation is not anywhere near the level of the Charity Commission. So in terms of regulation and that burden that comes with it, you need to think about whether you are prepared to submit your organisation to the heavy level of regulation that applies to charities, or whether you want to have far less oversight and transparency about what you're doing. Okay, so once you've gone through all of those considerations and decided whether you want to be a charity or a social enterprise, you've still got more decisions to make. So your next question is going to be structure. What is the best legal structure for what I'm trying to do? I'll start with charities. Now, there are a huge number of legal structures available to charities, and I'm only going to talk about 3 of those today. And the reason for that is these are the 3 most common structures for new charities. Some of you might have heard of others, for example, unincorporated associations, community benefit societies that were formerly known as industrial and provident societies, royal charter bodies, statutory corporations. There are a whole range of other legal structures available, but they are far less common than the three that you've got on the slide there. So these are the ones I'm going to focus on. How to choose between them? That's what you're probably most interested in. Well, if you are looking at simply setting up a charity that will be a grant-making charity with general charitable purposes, so this would be an organisation where you've got a fund, a big pot of money, perhaps an endowment, which has been invested to generate an income. And what you plan to do with that is to decide on other charities or good causes that you want to give grants to throughout the year. If that's the sort of charity that you want to set up, this is the only type of charity where we would recommend a charitable trust structure. Now, the reason for that is because if you're looking to do anything else, if you are looking to own land, to raise finance, to have members, to employ staff, or to deliver services, if you're looking to be an operational charity with any of those sorts of activities, then what that brings with it is the risk of personal liability if you're a charitable trust. The reason for that is as soon as you start engaging with third parties, there is a risk of liability. There's a risk of something going wrong and those third parties bringing a claim against the charity. Now, if you're a charitable trust, that doesn't have what we call separate legal personality. It is not an entity that is recognized in law as if it were a person. And so once the assets of the charitable trust are exhausted, that third party can go after the assets of the individual trustees. Of course, you can take out insurance to provide some protection, but ultimately there is always going to be that residual risk of personal liability. So the more that you're doing, the more operational, the more risk of personal liability there is, the less appropriate it is to be a charitable trust. And what you should be looking at instead is either setting yourself up as a CIO or as a charitable company, where personal liability is limited. And the reason for that is both those types of legal structures are recognized in law as if those entities were persons. Therefore, they can sue and be sued in their own name. And what that means is that if a third party is suing the charity and all of the assets of that charity are exhausted, it is generally not possible to go after the personal assets of the trustees or directors. Now, there are some exemptions to that. For example, if you were to engage in wrongful trading under insolvency law, then it is possible in certain circumstances for personal liability to arise, but it's very rare and it's the exception rather than the rule. And so generally speaking, those structures provide you with limited personal liability, and that's an advantage over a charitable trust structure. So how to choose between a charitable company and a CIO, if that's what you're looking at? Well, on the slide here, you've got a table that just gives you some of the key differences. These are not all of the differences, but some of the key ones that are relevant for your decision making. Now, starting with charitable companies and structure, how you set them up, a charitable company is formed at Companies House, and this is a very quick process. You can set up a charitable company in a day at Companies House. Well, all you need to do is make sure that you have articles of association that are appropriate for a charitable company, and you can find a model set of articles on the Charity Commission's website. And then you apply to set up your charity with those articles, and hey presto, you have a charitable company. However, that is not yet recognised by the Charity Commission as a charity. And in order to register with the Commission, you need proof of income. You need to show that you have £5,000 income in your charity before you're able to register with the Charity Commission. Now, in contrast to that, a CIO only exists once registered with the Charity Commission. And as such, there is no requirement for proof of income. Because how could you? If you haven't got an entity, how could you have any income yet? So in order to set up a CIO, the starting point is to draft the constitution, again, based on the model constitution that's available on the Charity Commission website, and you submit an application this time to the Charity Commission. You don't need any income to do this. So there's a difference between a charitable company and a CIO. Of course, that does mean that there's a delay with setting up a CIO. And so if speed is important, if you need to have an entity in place to enter into contracts or to get started with something, then you might find that a CIO creates a delay for you. However, the charitable company route doesn't necessarily provide you with much of an advantage because there can be difficulties in opening a bank account before you're a registered charity. So you end up in a bit of an awkward catch-22 sometimes with charitable companies. You've got the entity, you want to register with the commission. To do that, you need proof of income, which unless you've got an offer from a recognised grant funding body like National Lottery, for example, you need a bank account and you need a bank statement showing £5,000 of income. Now, if a bank won't open a bank account until you're registered, you can see that that creates a catch-22. Now, we have experience at the moment that banks are being particularly cautious about opening bank accounts for unregistered charities due to the pandemic. And in the best of times, banks can be slightly difficult and awkward with setting up accounts for unregistered charities. So again, it is an option that gives you an entity quickly, but it might not necessarily give you a huge advantage in terms of time if it takes you a long time to get your bank account sorted out before you can apply to register. In terms of regulation, of course, a charitable company is both a company, so regulated by company law, and a charity, so regulated by charity law. And what this means in terms of ongoing regulation is that you are required to submit filings to both Companies House and the Charity Commission. So there is an additional administrative burden there and a small cost because the filings at Companies House, there are fees payable for those filings. There aren't any with the Charity Commission at the moment. However, in practice, most of the filings are very similar. It doesn't create a huge additional burden because the accounts that you file are the same. You don't have to prepare a different set of accounts for filing with Companies House than you do with the Charity Commission. And an important point here to make really clear is that if you're a charitable company, you do not have a company and a charity. You have one entity, which is both a charity and a company. And there's often quite a bit of misunderstanding about that point. In contrast, a CIO is only regulated by charity law, and so you only have to submit filings to the Charity Commission. You don't need to worry about Companies House filings at all. Finally, and this is only really a concern if you're looking at taking out loans to finance your organisation. For companies, there is something called a register of charges at Companies House. And if you're looking to take out a loan, which will be secured with a fixed and floating charge over the assets of the charitable company, then lenders will be quite comfortable that they can register their charge at Companies House and have assurance that they have a first legal charge over the assets of the charitable company. There is no such register for CIOs, and so that might make lenders slightly less comfortable in lending to a CIO than to a charitable company. If you're going to have property and you can mortgage that property, then the position is fairly similar either way. But if that's a consideration, if that's a concern for you, then again, it might make a charitable company slightly more appealing than a CIO. Okay, moving on to structures for social enterprises. Again, I am not going to go through absolutely every structure that's available. There are a huge number of options for social enterprises. You could be a sole trader, a limited liability partnership, an unincorporated association, again, a community benefit society that's not charitable. There are lots of options here, but I'm going to focus again on the most common ones, the ones that we most commonly are asked to advise on. And as you'll see from the slide, these are all types of company. So I'm going to start by looking at the difference between a company limited by shares and a company limited by guarantee. Which of those should you choose? Well, this is quite a simple question, actually, because really, in order to decide, what you need to ask is, do I have a need for shares? Have I got investors? Am I going to be issuing shares to investors who are then going to participate in the profits of the company to a certain extent? If so, you need a company limited by shares because there is no other way for investment in that way. Yes, you can have lenders, but you can't have that kind of investment where you participate in the profits of the company unless you've got share capital. So then you would need a company limited by shares. If, on the other hand, you are not looking at doing anything like that, and all you want to do is make sure that you're labeling this up very clearly as a not-for-profit, so no shareholders, no profits being shared by investors in the enterprise, then you should be looking at a company limited by guarantee. And this legal structure is the one that is most commonly associated with not-for-profit organisations. So that's your question there. Do I want shareholders or not? Now, just a brief word of warning, if you do want shareholders and if you are looking at a company limited by shares, there is a huge amount of regulation when you are issuing shares, especially if you're going out to the public to invite people to invest in your social enterprise. It's a heavily regulated area, regulated by the FCA, and you do need to take professional advice on this. It is not something to get wrong. Now, regardless of whether you're looking at a company limited by shares or a company limited by guarantee, you could wrap all of this up in something called a community interest company. Now, a community interest company can be either. It can be a company limited by shares or a company limited by guarantee. And all it is it's a statutory wrapper over the company structure to provide additional assurance to the public that this is a company that is a social enterprise. It is a particular type of company that was created specifically for social enterprises. And it creates this statutory set of rules and regulation that layer over the company structure. In order to be a community interest company, you need to have a community interest purpose. So you need to satisfy that community interest test. It is a far easier test to satisfy than a charitable purposes test, because really, as long as you can say that what you're doing is going to benefit the public or some section of the public in some way, and you can demonstrate and illustrate what the advantage, that community benefit will be, then you are likely to be eligible to be a community interest company. There is a lot of guidance on this on the KIC regulator website. Provided that you're doing something that will benefit the community in some way, and you want to set up a community interest company, what the legislation then does is create something called an asset lock. Now, this means that all of the assets within that community interest company may only ever be distributed out of the community interest company, either at full market value or in advancement of those community purposes, or to another asset locked body that is named in your articles of association. So you are very restricted on what you can do with the assets. And again, this provides that layer of assurance, because it's a statutory asset lock for the public, that the assets cannot be applied for personal benefit. Features of the asset lock include the dividend cap. So if you are setting up a company limited by shares and you are going to have investors, there is a cap on the level of dividend income that can be paid out of the KIC. That doesn't apply to normal companies limited by shares. And so your investors will need to understand that there is going to be a ceiling on the return on their investment. And you should make sure that you're very clear about how the dividend cap will apply and the impact that that will have for any investors. Other features include director remuneration. Where you're a KIC, you've got to be a little bit more careful about how much you pay your directors. You can remunerate them. It's not like charities where the trustees can't be paid for their role as trustees. You absolutely can pay directors for their role as directors of the KIC, but you need to make sure that that remuneration is appropriate and benchmarked against what other organisations similar to yours are doing. You cannot pay excessive amounts of remuneration, because that would be a breach of the asset lock, which is set out in statute. Now, those sorts of rules don't apply to companies limited by shares or companies limited by guarantee that are not regulated by the KIC legislation. Finally, on dissolution of a community interest company, again, the asset lock means that the assets of the KIC have to be passed to another asset locked body. So it's similar to charities in that respect. Assets of a charity, when you close it, have to be passed to another charity with substantially the same charitable purposes as yours. So if that sounds of interest to you, then you might want to look at the community interest company structure. So finally, just to finish off, some top tips on getting started. Now, I've talked about a range of different legal structures here, but before you go ahead and start forming it, some of the things that I would suggest you think about first. Who do you want on your board? And this comes back to this question about control. Who's going to be involved and why and how? And certain things that you should think about, regardless of whether you want to be a charity or a social enterprise, are what are the skills and experience necessary for me to have a really effective board to achieve the purposes that I am setting out to achieve? What sort of recruitment process should you go through to attract the trustees or the directors that you want for your board? Think about diversity. This is really critical. The more diverse your board is, and I mean that in the widest possible sense, diversity of background, of experience, of interest, that diversity tends to lead to more robust decision making, and it improves governance on a board. So think about that. What kind of board do you want? And do you have the people lined up, ready to go and all on board and willing to get invested in this new enterprise? You should also think about your key stakeholders. Do you want to have members? Are you going to be a CIO or a charitable company with a separate membership to your board? In both of those structures, you've got two choices. You can set up what CIOs call a foundation model, or you can set up what CIOs call an association model. And you can, with a charitable company, do the same thing. You can have a foundation model, which means that the only people who are members are the people on the board for the time being. Or you can have this association model with a much wider membership that is different to the membership on your board. What that does is provide a layer of accountability for the board, because the board members, the directors or trustees, are then accountable to that separate body of members. Of course, that brings with it other considerations around control, around involvement, and good governance. For charities, what's really important to understand if you do have members is that for both CIOs and charitable companies, in fact, all forms where there are members, the members of those charities owe fiduciary duties to the charity, which means they have to act in the best interest of the charity when exercising their votes. They cannot represent their own interests. Now, that's different to social enterprises. If you set up a community interest company or a normal company, whether it's limited by shares or limited by guarantee, the shareholders or members, depending on which structure you go for, can act entirely in their own interests. There is no obligation on them to act in the best interests of the social enterprise. So you need to think carefully about the stakeholders, who you want to be involved, and why in your governance setup. Of course, you need to put in place a business plan, and you need to think about your funding and make sure that you've got the funding you need to get started. If you are applying for grant funding, I would encourage you to think about whether or not you need professional advice on tax, on regulatory requirements, on legal matters, and if you do, factor that into your grant application to get the right amount of startup funding. Don't overlook the benefit of professional advice in getting your structure right from the outset, and make sure you've got a line in your budget to allow for any professional advice that you think you need. Choose a name. Once you've got all of that done, decide on a good name and then go ahead and get started with formation. Now, I can't take you through the process for forming all of the different types, but there is a huge amount of guidance. And so what I just want to finish off with is pointing you in the right direction for the guidance that is available for the process and the steps to take. Now, if you're looking at setting up a charity, the Charity Commission has absolutely oodles of information. There is a whole section on setting up a charity, and then there's lots and lots of guidance on managing charities and the ongoing obligations that will apply once you are established. So I would encourage, if you haven't already done so, I'd encourage you to go to the Commission's website and have a look. In terms of drafting your charitable purposes, the Commission, as I said, has a whole page explaining about charitable purposes, and it even has a page setting out model objects, so you can get a bit of a head start as to what you should draft in your governing documents. Similarly, the Commission publishes model governing documents for different types of legal structures, so you can use those as a starting point if you don't have a budget or you would prefer not to seek professional advice for what you're looking to do. If you're looking at setting up a KIC, I would suggest that you have a look on the KIC regulator website, because again, there's a lot of guidance available there. Read through it, see what the requirements are, and get your head around what it is that you need. Have a look on the website for the model articles of association, which include all of the statutory requirements for a KIC, and then all of the forms are downloadable from the website too. It's very easy to use and very, very user-friendly. For other types of social enterprise, and generally, actually, even if you're looking at setting up a charity or a KIC, one website that you may or may not have heard of, one organisation that is super useful, is the NCVO, which is the National Council for Voluntary Organisations. Now, they have membership and they have an awful lot of resources that are available to their members. But for very small and startup charities and social enterprises, you might find that you're eligible for free membership of the NCVO, because you only start to pay for your membership once you have an income over certain thresholds. And if you become a member of NCVO, that gives you access to all of the useful guides, checklists, and resources available on the website. So have a look, have a browse through the website, have a look at the membership options and see if that might be helpful to you. Finally, two other organisations that I think just warrant a mention here are Social Enterprise UK and the B Corp structure or option. Both of these are basically sort of kite marks. They're like labels and branding that you can attach to your social enterprise. In order to become a member of Social Enterprise UK and to be able to use that badge, I'm a member of Social Enterprise UK, you need to satisfy the criteria that they set out, and you can see all of that on their website. But again, that website has a lot of useful guidance and information about social enterprises generally. Similarly with B Corps, this is a US concept, and it is all about demonstrating that your company is not just about making money, that you have community or environmental objectives, purposes that are embedded into the very fabric of what your company does. And B Corp is becoming increasingly popular as a label, a brand that you can attach to your organization to demonstrate your credentials as a social enterprise. Again, you need to satisfy particular criteria to be a B Corp, so do have a look on the website if it's of interest to you. Okay, I've gone too far. So just on the slide there, I've got pictures of the key members of the charities team. If you are interested in contacting us for any particular advice on what you're looking to do, please do get in touch with any of the members of the team that you see there. We'd be more than happy to talk to you about what you're looking to do and give you a fee proposal for any advice that you require. Now, just before I get on to questions and looking and answering your questions, I'd just like to run that poll again, if you wouldn't mind, just to see whether what I've talked about today has shifted your thinking, whether you're still thinking of setting up a charity, whether you're now thinking, actually, I'd like a social enterprise, and whether you've moved from the I'm not sure into one of the other categories. So if I could just give you a few minutes to answer that poll, and we'll just share the results once you're done. Just getting there, we've got about 70% answered the poll already. Okay, I think that's probably everybody who's going to, oh no, it's still going up. Okay, so the results of the poll are on the screen now. So as you see, that's really interesting. We've got more people now looking at setting up a charity, a few more as well looking at setting up a social enterprise. So that's gone up from 9% to 15%, and with charities, it's gone up from 16% to 22%. So hopefully this webinar has provided you with some answers to help you get started. That's really good to see. Great. So finally, questions. And again, as I said, thank you very much to those of you who sent questions in advance. We don't have time to answer them all, but I will answer as many of them as I can. Questions sent in advance, I'm going to have a look at a couple of those. We've had a few as well that have come through while I've been speaking. And if you have any more that you haven't already sent, please do pop them into the questions chat for us to answer. So, questions sent in advance. I have been asked about this question. I have a limited company already. Should I set up a charity or a charitable foundation? Now, that's an interesting question because it depends on what your limited company does. If you've got a company and you are looking to convert it into a charity, then you don't necessarily need to set up a new entity, because as you'll have understood from what I've explained in the webinar, it is possible for charitable companies to exist. If you've got a company that is maybe running at the moment as a social enterprise or just as a normal company on a not-for-profit basis, provided that your company is limited by guarantee, then it is possible for you to convert it into a charity by simply adopting articles of association that are suitable for a charity and then applying to register the company with the Charity Commission. Now, of course, you do have to think about things like who's on the board, is anybody on the board also an employee or otherwise remunerated, because all of those arrangements might need to be adjusted if you're looking at switching your company into a charity. If alternatively you don't want to convert the company that you've got into a charity, but you want to set up perhaps a foundation, a charitable foundation to sit alongside your company, this is something that's quite common, and we regularly advise our corporate clients on doing this. Many companies quite like the idea of sort of wrapping up their CSR activities by having a separate charitable foundation through which to funnel all of their charitable giving. And that's quite a common thing that we see. It's very important to understand that charities have to operate independently. So if you are looking at setting up a charitable foundation to sit alongside a company, that's known as a corporate foundation. And there is guidance about corporate foundations on the Charity Commission website. So I would encourage you to have a look at that. It's really crucial that the charity operates independently and that you can demonstrate that to the Commission when you apply. It should not exist merely to advance the decisions taken by the company about the CSR objectives of the company. And there has to be a really distinct charitable purpose beyond simply making the company look good from a CSR perspective. So have a look at the guidance on corporate foundations if that's something that you're thinking of doing. Okay, another question. If relevant, would like to hear tips for changing from a charity to a CIO. Now that's an interesting question because a CIO is, of course, a charity, as you'll have understood from the webinar content. What I'm guessing you might mean by that question is that you're currently an unincorporated charity, perhaps established as a charitable trust or an unincorporated organisation, and you're thinking of converting into a CIO. Again, this is really common, and we advise on incorporation of charities all the time. We always have various incorporation matters on the go at any given time. Now, the key reasons for considering this are the ones that I talked about earlier, concerns around personal liability. If you are on the board of a charity that is unincorporated, either as a trust or an unincorporated association, and you are carrying out the sorts of activities, the operational activities that I talked about, there is a residual risk of personal liability. What this can mean is that people feel nervous and perhaps less inclined to want to volunteer to become a trustee of the charity because of concerns about personal liability. It can also mean that if you're looking at embarking on a new project, for example, a significant construction project or something along those lines, that the trustees might be more inclined to adopt an unduly conservative approach because they're more worried about their personal exposure and not focusing solely on what's going to be best for the charity. Now, the trustees of a charity have lots of duties and responsibilities. If you're interested in knowing more about the trustee role and responsibilities, we deliver regular charity trustee induction and refresher training every 3 months. It's delivered at the moment through Zoom. It's delivered virtually, although in normal times we do deliver it rotating around our office locations. But for now, it's available virtually. If you're interested in attending, if you are already a trustee or you'd just like to know more about becoming a trustee of a charity, please do sign up on our website. You can head to the events section to see the upcoming dates for that training. We do charge for that. It's only £50 plus VAT per delegate, but the reason for the charge is to ensure that people do attend. And this is because we limit numbers. It's a very interactive workshop. It's 4 hours of training delivered by me and my colleague Sonia O'Reilly, who covers some of the key considerations from an employment perspective that trustees need to be aware of. 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon, workshop style with case studies, exercises, and very interactive. For that reason, we have to limit numbers. And so we make a charge to ensure that those who do sign up actually attend, and it doesn't mean that others miss out. So if you're interested in coming along to that, please do have a look on our website. Alternatively, you could have a look on the Norfolk Community Foundation website, where there is a free webinar that I delivered for them in January on charity trustee duties and responsibilities. Again, that's the Norfolk Community Foundation website. So all of those duties and responsibilities are really important, and it is important to think about acting properly in the best interest of the charity when you're a charity trustee. And if your unincorporated status impedes that in any way, then it might be appropriate for the board to consider incorporating. Now, the process of incorporating a charity from being a trust or an unincorporated association to becoming a CIO or a charitable company involves setting up a brand new charity. So the starting point is you set up a CIO or a charitable company and you register it with the Charity Commission. When you do this, there's a little box you can tick on the online application form to inform the Commission that this new charity is being set up to replace an existing charity, and then they will consider the application in light of that. Once you've got that new charity set up, you then need to transfer all of the assets, employees, liabilities, everything from the old charity to the new one. And then the old charity is generally removed from the register of charities unless you receive a substantial amount of legacy income into that old charity and therefore want to keep it open as a shell, which is linked to the new charity to avoid the risk of losing legacy income that has been specifically left to that old charity. You get a new charity number and you then start, or you carry on your charitable activities through the new CIO or charitable company. So it's quite an involved process. It does involve the transfer of assets, and depending on the complexity of your charity, you might find that you need professional advice to support you with that. So it is something to consider if you are an unincorporated charity and you're concerned about personal liability. Okay. Final question. I think we've got time for just one more before I wrap up. I'm just having a look here. Okay, I've had a question here about converting an industrial and provident society, by which I'm assuming you mean a community benefit society, to a charity. So I didn't cover this in any detail in the webinar, so I'll just say a few words now about community benefit societies. They used to be called industrial and provident societies, but in 2014 new legislation was brought in, so they're now known either as cooperatives or community benefit societies. For charities, community benefit societies are the ones that are appropriate. You don't necessarily have to be a charity if you're a community benefit society, in the same way that you don't necessarily have to be a charity if you're a company. If you want to be a charity, then you can do that in the same sort of way as setting up or converting an existing company into a charity. So what you would do is adopt new rules that are charitable in nature for the community benefit society. Now, importantly, at the moment, the legal position for community benefit societies is that they are not registered with the Charity Commission. They are currently exempt from registration. So what that means is that you cannot apply to the Charity Commission for recognition as a charity once you've adopted your new charitable rules for your community benefit society. You'd need to incorporate a statutory asset lock in the rules, and you have to follow the quite complex process and longer process of updating your rules with the FCA, which is currently the regulator for mutuals, which is what a community benefit society is. So you go through all of that process to adopt the new rules, but you then cannot apply to register with the Charity Commission because you're currently exempt. So what you would then need to do instead is apply to HMRC for recognition as a charity for tax purposes. And then what HMRC will do is review and consider your rules to check that everything that's in the rules is appropriate for a charitable community benefit society. And critically, that includes the statutory asset lock. You need to make sure that the assets are locked in to the community benefit society, both in terms of ongoing running of that community benefit society and on dissolution. And you need to ensure that you've got wholly and exclusively charitable purposes stated in the rules. Of course, if you want more advice on converting a community benefit society into a charitable community benefit society, please do get in touch. There are other things you can do with community benefit societies to change legal structure entirely, but again, that's sort of beyond the scope of the webinar today. But if you have any specific questions about that, please get in touch and we'd be very happy to have an initial conversation with you and then provide you with a fee estimate for any work that you require. Okay, I think that's probably all that I've got time for today. What I would like just to finish off by saying is that there will be a survey that pops up on your screen in a moment, and we would be really, really grateful if you would complete the survey just to give us feedback on the webinar. In particular, if there's anything that you would like us to cover in future webinars, please do let us know. We have an ongoing rolling programme of webinars on charities and social enterprise and charity law. So if there's a particular topic that you're interested in that you haven't seen advertised as coming up in our programme of webinars, please do let us know, because we are very keen to provide you with content that's of interest to you. And thank you once again for attending. It's been a pleasure and I hope you found it helpful. Thank you.